Hi, and welcome to Parenting Today for Tomorrow podcast. My name is Josh Canarum. I'm one of the pastors here at Valleydale Church, and we are so excited that you've joined us on this journey through parenting. Our goal is simply this, to help you navigate the craziness that it is raising a child in this world. Our mission here at Valleydale is simple. We are generations helping our busy community know Christ and live for Him. And that's what we want to do. We want to help you raise a generation that knows Christ and lives for Him every day. Along the way, if you have any questions, we would love for you to send those on to parenting@valleydale.org. We would love as a staff or as pastors to answer those questions. Also, in a future episode of the podcast, we'll be dealing with those big issues that you have in mind. Thank you for listening, and God bless. Welcome to the newest installment of the Valleydale Church podcast universe. This is an exciting time. We're kicking off a new podcast that is focused on parenting, and this is going to be a really great opportunity for those of you who are just looking to add some tools to your toolbox of how do we parent? How do we parent in a Christian atmosphere? And we're going to look at different aspects of that. My name is Josh Canarum. I am the student pastor here at Valleydale, and I'm really excited to be able to host this podcast as we dig into some different topics. Throughout each week, we're going to address particular issues of parenting and discipleship, and I think you're going to be blessed by it. Today, we are joined by Barry. And this is Dr. Barry Chesney, for those of you scoring at home. And he is our discipleship pastor, been here about a year, and has done a phenomenal job in just bringing a great discipleship culture to this church, from our life groups to our age group ministries, organizing our volunteer work. So it has been a blessing. And he's also a parent of 5 children.
5 children.
5 children.
Yes.
So if anybody can be an expert the hard way, that is the way to do it.
It's really funny. I considered myself an expert before we had children, and then once we started having children, I just realized I don't know anything about
I think
parenting.
By the time I'm 80, I will know I know nothing. It's just a diminishing
of
knowledge. That's exactly right. But great. And so we're excited. Today, the topic that we're looking at is this idea of the culture, the discipleship culture in a home. And I think this is so important because it's the foundation. Yeah. This is really what we're talking about when it comes to if you're going to disciple children, you've got to have that home culture foundation started. It can't happen anywhere else outside of that. And so let's just kind of jump in. Why does our home's culture matter?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in honor of the baseball playoffs right now, I'll give you an illustration. Several years ago, there's some big market teams like New York Yankees and others that have these really high payrolls. Well, the Kansas City Royals are a small market team, low payroll. They just can't compete money-wise with some of these other teams. So they said, you know what, we can't win by dollars, but we can win with our culture. And so what they did, they looked at their roster and they realized we have a lot of young players with young families. And they started doing things as an organization to invest in those young families. And so they won the World Series in 2015. And after the game, I believe it was the general manager that said, hey, we win with culture. And so there is a home field advantage when you are a parent, you follow God's word, and you build a culture that honors the Lord and follows His plan. And so there's a book that we talked about, I looked at this summer, called The Culture Code. And it talks about the culture comes from the Latin word cultus. And there are several different meanings of that term, but one of the meanings, it means to labor or to cultivate. And so culture is something that we do, the book says. It's not just something that we are, but there are certain things that we do, like you cultivate your garden. So if you're going to cultivate, you want to have a home culture that honors God, there's certain things that you have to do.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. We talked about, so a lot of the presentations that will be in this podcast were actually taught on a midweek. And in those sessions, one of the first things you talked about was when we begin to create the culture in a Christian home, it really begins with that relationship between the husband and wife. And so talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I looked at Colossians 3, and that chapter really is about the new life as a Christian. So, where Paul says, put on kindness and humility, and you should be forgiving, and you should be grateful. Those are just, those characteristics should mark a Christian, because we're changed and we're filled with the Spirit, hopefully. And then he goes on to talk about the husband and wife relationship. And so he gives the wife one command. He said, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting to the Lord. And that word submit means to order yourself under a leader. It's a voluntary thing. He says, wives, in order to have order in the home, just voluntarily order yourself under your husband, since he is the spiritual leader. And then the second thing, so the wives had one commandment, the husbands have two. He says, husbands, love your wives. This is that agape, self-sacrificial love. Cherish, honor, love your wives. Yeah. And then the second thing, which is so crucial, and especially when you have young children, this can happen. It says, and do not be harsh with them. Husbands, don't be harsh with your wives. And we talked to that word means don't be embittered. Don't be angry at your wife, because that's the opposite of a loving husband. Yeah. And so when you have angry husbands and frustrated wives, that's not a good home culture. And so Paul says the first thing, follow God's plan for your marriage, and that will create this healthy home culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see that in relationships. The struggles, some of the families that really struggle are the ones where the parents just aren't on the same page. Right. They're having a hard time communicating. They're having a hard time just really leading with any purpose or direction, because they're fighting amongst themselves, much less trying to lead their children on there. And of course, when we talk about this idea of submission and sacrifice, it's just a perfect picture of what Christ has done for us. And so even in that, we're already modeling this Christ-like character for our children, and they get to see that, and they can grow from that. Well, tell me a little bit. So the second thing we talked about was this idea of marriage, the marriage relationship being the primary relation. I don't think that's always true. And we'll talk a little bit later about this idea of have a child-centered home and how that can be a struggle. But talk a little bit about how do we prioritize the marriage, the husband and wife relationship for those families who have a husband and wife in the home. How do we prioritize that relationship? How do we manage that to where it is the center and not left behind or kind of left to wither on the vine?
Yeah, so it is interesting that Paul addressed the wives and husbands before he addressed the children. And if you go all the way back to Genesis, there's Adam and Eve. They were not created with children. They were created as a couple. And then the children came later. And so that just talks about the importance of the priority of the husband and wife relationship. And just the natural, as you know, Josh, the natural gravity of life pulls you toward a child-centered home. Absolutely. Because you give so much of your energy, your time, your resources, it goes to the kids. Yeah. And at the end of the day, I just want to go to bed. You know, and
that's one of those things where it's not just one phase. I think if you have a young child, you think, hey, this season will be over. We'll finally get back on track. We'll have meals together all the time. But right now, it's just crazy. It turns out every phase of parenting seems to be pretty wild. There's just always kinds of commitments. There's homework. Yeah. I thought that once we got kids in the older grades, so I have a fifth grader and a seventh grader. I thought, by now they can do their homework on their own. They can manage their own schedules. Well, no, that is not the case. Not because they're not trying, but just because there's so much. And so here we are in a new phase of life, but still just as busy. And we have to be really intentional about that. I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
The guy that discipled me in college used to say, the man you are now is the man you're becoming. In other words, as now, so then. So if you're not setting the priority now when the kids are young, that the marriage is the priority, it won't be that way later. Yeah, it just it always pulls toward a child-centered home. And so one of the things we talked about two ways. How do you know? Like, how do you know if you have a child-centered home? Because some may think, well, that's not what I want, but how do I know? Right. And we said there are a couple things. One, if you cannot remember the last time you and your spouse had quality time together, it could just be a quick lunch away, or maybe just a walk around the neighborhood, just something simple but meaningful. Yeah. And if you think, well, I can't remember the last time we had that time together, then that's probably a good indication, at least in this season of your marriage, your home life, you have a child-centered home. And then the second thing was if your children are making decisions that affect the whole family. Yeah. And this could be trips to school, to sports, to so many different areas. So I'm not saying you don't include, or you want their input, you value you want to make decisions in light of their abilities and all those kinds of things. But mom and dad make those decisions, not the child.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. That for us, we are fortunate. I'm fortunate to just live around the corner. So we have, in our family, the way we live this out is my wife and I, we try to have lunch at least once a week. And unfortunately, my schedule, not everybody's schedule can work like that, but once a week we try to just have lunch because it's kid-free zone. And it's amazing how much conversation you can have in a kid-free zone. It's amazing how little conversation you can have with when we run it out and there's just lots to talk about in the home. But such a nice time, kind of break that time down. And then date nights. I know a lot of people do date nights. Just trying to find that space. Because if you wait till the end of the day to try to have conversations, somebody's going to be asleep or somebody's just tired of talking.
That's right.
Our children use a lot of words, and which is great. Love it. One day they won't, but hey, it is. Sometimes it's not the right time to talk.
One of the questions, we had a Q&A at the end, and one of the questions was how can my spouse and I make time at the end of the day to communicate? And one of our panelists said, hey, don't wait till the end of the day.
Right.
It starts early in the day. If it may just be even, if one spouse has to leave early, it may just be a text message or a call at lunchtime. So it's all throughout the day. It's not just, okay, it's 9 o'clock now, we can communicate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because we talked earlier today, actually, in a meeting, we talked about, hey, if you don't schedule something, it's not going to happen. And so even scheduling things, scheduling date nights, scheduling time to be together, that is so important because otherwise it's not. There's enough whirlwind of life that is going to take over, and that is going to fall to the wayside. I wanted to press on this idea of the child center home. I know this seems to be the era of child activities, and activities don't just take like one night; they take a lifetime. It seems like it takes so much energy. There's practices, there's performances, there's fundraisers, there's out of town trips. How do you manage that? I know you have 5 kids, several playing sports right now. What's an example maybe that you have found that to manage the pressures of all the time that is out there? Yeah,
well, we haven't always done that well, but what we're currently doing, we try to limit really to just 1 or 2 things. And obviously, our youngest is 5 months, so he's not too active right now.
Not yet, but you got to start him early. So
that's right. Yeah. So we just decided we have 3 boys playing flag football now. So we just chose a league that it's a city league, but it's one that they just have the practice and the games on the same day.
Yeah.
And so that was just a simple. It made sense for us. It may not work for every family, but instead of having multiple nights and different leagues and driving all over the place, we just felt like, for this season of life with a baby at home, it just made sense to, if they're going to play in the NFL one day, then they'll still develop their talents. But for right now, this is just a mom and dad decision. This is what works for our family. Yeah,
I see this in so many families. As a student pastor, I think, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it does feel like parents kind of operate out of this fear that their child's going to miss out on something. And so rather than allow them to miss out on something, they just fill their entire calendar with activity. And the problem is that as we're talking about this home culture, well, they're never at home. And so they don't even get to live out that home culture. They don't get to see the day-to-day life. They don't get to have those conversations that are so important to pop up because they're just running from practice to practice. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen a quick handoff on the team. They drop the kid off for the football game. They got to get the daughter to dance class, and they're going to pick up and sometimes they forget they haven't fed the kid dinner yet. So it's just, that's life, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah,
and as parents, you have to be able to pick the choices, pick the path, because the kids don't know how to pick the path. They don't have the wisdom. They haven't lived those times. And so the parents have to definitely decide the path. So that's great. Well, there's one other element in terms of culture and home, and let's talk a little bit about that. We talk about engaging the minds and the hearts of our children, and I think that is so true. And not just the minds, but also the hearts, and not just the hearts, but also the minds. And how do you kind of work that out in a practical way as a parent?
Yeah, so that this comes from Ephesians 6:4, where it says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger." And one source I read said, but when fathers is in the plural, it's applying to moms and dads. So just moms don't think, well, okay, it's not my responsibility. It's moms and dads. So do not make your children angry, is what it means. And so you may wonder, well, what do I do that makes my child angry? I read this. What makes teenagers the angriest is having to navigate through a world without adequate direction from their parents. When parents are not the ones saying, hey, here's how you prepare for a test. Here's how you can do better in this sport. Or when parents aren't offering that guidance, they just feel like, I don't know what I'm doing. No one's told me. And they get angry and they get frustrated. And there's other things that we can do too. Sometimes when we're being sinful. Sometimes we make mistakes. We can make our children angry. So when we do that, because we're sinners too, we should repent. We should say, first, God, forgive me, and then we should go to our child and say, you know what, I'm sorry. I was wrong, and please forgive me. So he says that's what not to do, but then he says, here's what to do. Bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And the term for discipline there is talking about just an act of discipline. There's multiple ways to discipline your child. Discipline is aimed to get out to the heart.
Yeah.
As you know, Hebrews 12 talks about this. It says, for the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So discipline is aimed to train the heart. Yeah. And there are different ways you can do that. There's multiple ways. Dr. Swindoll has a great book on parenting from surviving to thriving. He talks about different ways you can discipline and, all those types of things. So that's I won't get into that. But then he said also, in the instruction of the Lord. And that word for instruction really means to place on the mind. So there is a verbal correction that goes along with discipline. So it's not just, okay, you're grounded or you're getting a spanking or you're in timeout. Those are all good measures of discipline, but it's not only that. There has to be instruction that we're placing on their mind. There has to be a verbal component. And so if we're not doing both of those, we're missing something. Yeah. We need to get to the heart and to the mind.
Well, and something I've noticed with this generation is they need to know the why. If it's going to transform them, if they're going to really take it to heart, they need to know the why. They ask more questions probably, and they have access to more information than any other generation. And so if you can't explain it, and if you're not willing to take the time to explain it, it's not going to take root. All you're going to do is have taken their phone away or send them to their room. That transformation happens when they understand what is happening, why they're in trouble. They need to know the why. And I think that's a huge thing for us as parents of this generation to be able to say, hey, and they can handle it. They're smart. They have to deal with a lot of complex problems. They have to deal with a lot of things, and that is so important. So we've talked about these key elements, capturing the hearts, creating a culture where we have an ordered relationship with the husband and wife. We've talked about this idea of making that marriage relationship the primary thing. Tell me a little bit about what are some of the ways, the things that get in the way of building that home culture? What would you say are some of the traps we need to watch out for?
Yeah, one would certainly be busyness.
Yeah.
Busyness, focusing too much on entertainment.
Yeah.
Just, what's the next show that's coming on, and you just fall asleep, and you begin going through the motions, and you're not intentionally investing. One of the things my wife is great about, we're at the table or we're driving, she'll say, if someone starts complaining, she'll say, okay, tell me 3 things you're thankful for.
Yeah.
And that just immediately changes the atmosphere of the car or the table, and it's just, okay, well, I'm thankful for the, and it's usually, it doesn't sound wholehearted at the time. Yeah. But it begins to change things. So just intentional conversation. We like to play games together sometimes. Yeah. It's, checkers or whatever it is. We got into Clue for a little while, or Mexican dominoes. Just those kinds of things. We like to do walks together, go to Veterans Park. So it doesn't always have to be, okay, we're just going to stare at each other for an hour and tell me your deepest thought. It's just
that's what I think people see. Like, we're going to do family time, which means we're just going to make awkward eye contact for the rest of the time and not make any memories. So I think that's right. I mean, here at Valleydale, this, our people are learning this, is our whole mission statement, our whole picture is we are generations helping our busy community know Christ and live for Him. And so we acknowledge here just at Valleydale, everybody is so busy. And you keyed in on that. It is hard, and it takes time, and it takes intentionality, and it takes energy. To me, that's one of the things. Sometimes I just don't know if I have the energy to have that conversation, to explain why that's not the best choice and what would be a better choice. But those are the seasons where I've got to figure out the rhythms of my life and make sure that I am creating pathways for people to hear that and to be able to speak into that into my kids. So I think that is fantastic. Well, hey, thank you so much for spending the time. This has been, I think, really incredibly helpful. And like I said, this is the foundation. If we don't have that home culture that is built around God's Word, if we don't have that intentionality in our home, then all of the rest of the things we're trying to do as parents is going to be undermined. It's just going to cut the legs right out under it. And so this is fantastic. For those of you who are listening in here, we want you to know that not only do we want you to hear this, but we want to engage with you. And so there's a email address, parenting@valleydale.org. We would love for you to send in any questions you might have. If this has sparked some kind of conversation, if you're like, I hear that, but I don't know how to do it, feel free. Just shoot us a quick email. We would love to do that. At the end of our little series of podcasts here, we are going to have a whole session on questions that come in. And I think that's going to be really helpful, and we'll have a chance to kind of engage with those. So we want there to be some feedback. So again, parenting@valleydale.org. Also, if you just want to say, hey, that you guys looked really cool sitting there, that would be great too. Whatever, encouragement is great. So that is fantastic. We would love to do that, and we look forward to our next session. And we'll you go back to your 5 kids, I'll go to my 2 kids, and we'll do the best that we can and rely on God to help us do the rest. So
That's right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Josh.
Thanks for listening. We hope you found this podcast encouraging and helpful as you raise your child. If you have any questions, send those on to parenting@valleydale.org. We'll see you next time.